Hi guys, so welcome to Python programming tutorials. So in this tutorials we are going to be learning um what variables or what identifiers are. Identifiers are mostly used to declare variables, but in this video we are going to be looking particularly at what identifiers are. So I'm trying to keep all these videos simple and short, so I'm going to be using simple terminologies because I assume most of you watching this video shouldn't know a lot about programming or don't know a lot about programming. So I'm trying to make these videos to be as introductory as possible. So initially, I'm going to read the definition of an identifier. A Python identifier is a name used to identify a variable, function, class, module, or any object. So as you can see, identifiers are used for several things in Python. We can use them for a variable name, a function, a class, and a module. So this definition may sound a little bit complex, so I'm going to break it down. So in the computer, once when you're writing programs, network applications, and various applications, you're going to be dealing with a lot of user data. For example, you're going to be having names. You can collect a username and you can collect an email from a user, and you want to do a bunch of things with this data. You can have numbers, a couple of data, and what you have to do is during your while you're coding, you want to save this data in somewhere. You want to save them in temporal locations where you can use at a later time or during the code at some portion of the code or some later time in your code. In that case, you want to save those variables somewhere, or those values. They can be text, they can be numbers, they can be whatever you want to save, binary stuff like images and whatever, but you want to save them somewhere. Now, as a program, while a code is running, you can't save them. You can save them in a file, but that will be too expensive, because if for every variable you want to use in your program, you need to open a file. It's going to make your program very slow. So the computer has what we call the RAM. The RAM is very fast kind of memory, because everything in the RAM disappears, or all data in the RAM disappears once the computer is restarted. So it's like some kind of a volatile memory. But the advantage of the RAM is very fast. The computer can easily read and write to the RAM with time at a faster rate. So usually programs need to store temporal information in the RAM. So for example, let's say you're writing a code and you collect some information from the user. Let's look here, we have 10. You can say maybe 10 is coming from somewhere, a user or somebody. So in that case, we can save it to A. Now, what's this A all about? All right, now we want to save it in the RAM, but the RAM is so complex. As a programmer, we don't want to care about how to get to the RAM, so we tell the computer to help us do that. But in doing that, we have to give it a name. So we tell the computer, please help me save this data in the RAM, and I'm going to attach a tag to it. That tag is known as an identifier. You're going to tell the computer, save this data for me in the RAM. I want to identify it using a particular name. So like you see in this case, I said save 10 to the RAM, and I want to identify it using the name A. In the other case, I said save 30 to RAM. I want to identify using the name B. In this other case, I said save 40.50 to the RAM. I want to identify it using the variable or the identifier X score. So you see, identifier is just a string, a name, a text. In this case, we have A, B score, and here we have a couple of identifiers. Now, but there are some rules you need to apply when using these names. For example, I'm going to show you some of the rules of an identifier. You can see from here, an identifier can't start with a number. So always know, if you try this, if I run this code, for example, you're going to see an error. All right. So an identifier can start with a number. All right. Next, an identifier can contain a space in between two words. So for example, if I write this, you're going to see Python is going to have some problem here. As you can see, first name and all this stuff, identifier can't contain a space. Python is even telling you already. Now we can see an identifier can contain a special character, like we have at. These are special punctuation characters like at. We have the ampersand sign, we have the dollar sign, we have the question mark. These are special characters. You can't have them in an identifier. If we try to run code here, we see cannot assign an operator, it's a bit confused. It doesn't know what we are doing here. So that's just like punctuations like this can be part of an identifier. So I just wanted to see that. So identifier can't have a special characters like punctuations and all that. It gets Python confused. So those are a few things you need to know about identifiers. Alright, now if you're confused, I'm using Visual Studio Code. You can learn from one of my videos on the channel on how to install Visual Studio Code. And I'm also using Jupyter Notebook in Visual Studio Code. So recent versions of Visual Studio Code came with Jupyter Notebook. So you don't need to install softwares like Anaconda to have access to Jupyter Notebooks. So that's why I'm using Jupyter Notebook. So you see you can't have a special like an operator in an identifier. For example, here is a minus. Python uses it in programming. These are all operators: minus, division, multiplication, and addition. So these are some rules of identifier. If you try this, you're gonna see it's not possible. So let's try this and run our identifier, and you see since it cannot assign an operator, it's confused. And here we see, so these are some of the rules for identifier you need to take note of, okay? Alright, like I said, I'm trying to make this video very simple. So I want to explain everything in simple terminologies so that everyone can understand. So those are the rules of identifiers. So I'm going to clear this, clear cell output. Alright, so next, let's see the right ways of using identifiers. In the beginning, I showed you guys the wrong ways of using identifiers. And in this, I'm going to show you the right way of using Python identifiers. Remember, this is the very basic of programming. You can start your programming journey from this point, following up through the other videos, and you're going to be updated. And by the time we are ending, you're going to be a very good programmer. The other videos we're going to be covering in this series of short video clips. So initially, we can see we have an identifier A, which means an identifier can just be a single character. Remember, I said it can't start with a number. So in this case, for example, we just have A. We assign the number 10 to an identifier A. Like I said, we are telling Python, please store the number 10 in memory. I'll identify it as A. So in this case, we call this a variable name. I'm going to explain to you what's a variable. For example, a variable is just an identifier that can change over time. For example, we have A, we can assign 10 to it. Later on, we can assign 20 to it. Later on, we can assign a string to it, and it's called a variable because its value can change at any time. Yeah, we are going to be looking at more of that later on, but as you can see, so we have A equals to 10. We have another identifier B. We assign the value 30. We have score, we have score, we have score. I did this to show you identifiers. Python is a case-sensitive language. So it means identifiers, these are all three different identifiers. In some languages, like I think Visual Basic or some languages are case insensitive, but most modern languages are case sensitive. So in this case, we see score, 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 but we can notice an uppercase S here, and we can notice an uppercase C and uppercase R here. So it makes these three to be different identifiers. Now we can see we can use all uppercase for identifiers. In this case, we have name. And when you use all uppercase for identifiers by convention, it means most programmers, experienced programmers, when you see, or if you're going through some code and you see a capital letter or uppercase used for all identifiers, it indicates it's a constant. It's a programming constant. It means the value should not change over time. For example, in that case, we are saying this name, the identifier name, in which is a variable in this case, is always going to be Emmanuel. We are never going to assign something else to it. Yeah, so we have funny guy, which means you can mix cases. And also, by convention, since an identifier cannot have a space in between like this, what we do with identifiers is if you have multiple names, you just use uppercase. So we have what we call camel. This is called camel casing. Camel casing is when it starts with a lowercase, and every successive word starts with an uppercase. So you see F here is a lowercase and G is an uppercase. That's the best way to separate names. I'm going to show you more examples. For example, you can see first name. In this case, you see first name. Here we have first and name. So here we call this camel casing. You see, we started with a lowercase and we have an uppercase. So we are assigning the string. You know, a string is what in programming, when we talk about string, we are talking about a bunch of characters. You know, one character is called a character, but once you have more than one character, we usually call it a string or a stream of text. So when I talk about string, I want you to understand I'm talking about a bunch of characters. So we have a string, we are trying, that's the name in this case, we are trying to assign it to an identifier first name. We have another string, Linda, we are assigning it to last name. So you see I'm using what we call camel casing here. Camel casing, you know, a camel, it has a small head and then it has some kind of a hunchback. So you can see here we start with a lowercase and then moving up we have it like a hunchback, which is an uppercase. So this is known as camel casing. Now since we can't use space in identifiers, in Python we use camel casing to separate words so that it can be seen, understood by someone going through your code. So as we can see, if we continue, we have another kind of way you can use to separate. An underscore is a valid identifier. An identifier can start with an underscore, it can end with another underscore, and it can even have an underscore within characters of the identifier. And an underscore is also used to separate words in an identifier. Since we can't use space, we can use an underscore. In this case, we call this case snake casing. You know, a snake is just a long string of some long stuff, lengthy stuff. So here we see we're using underscore to link these words together to form an identifier. So in that case, we can call it case snaking, um, snake casing. Sorry. So as you can see, we have another identifier, which in this case it starts with an uppercase, and then each successive new words or preceding new word starts with an uppercase too. So you see, this is usual by convention. Most programmers use this for class name or to declare objects. So in a class name usually starts with an uppercase. So we are going to be seeing all that later when we go through classes and the rest. So just always know when you see uppercase, if you're going through code which was written professionally by a professional programmer or a good programmer, you're going to see they usually start classes with an uppercase. It's known as Pascal casing. Pascal casing. So we have Pascal casing. So this is known as Pascal casing. All right. So in the other stuff here, okay, the other one we had camel, and this one we had snake casing. So here we call this Pascal casing. All right. So we have first name. We assign it to see. We use snake casing here. Here we use camel casing. And I just wanted to show you guys here an identifier can start with a an underscore. Yeah, so here we have an underscore, and you can have an underscore. Yeah, if you see another underscore in an identifier, this is usually used within classes. We are going to learn all this later, but if code is written professionally and you see an underscore, it's like an indication this variable is private. Yeah, we see I did something here like that. So each time a variable starts with an underscore, especially it is done usually within a class. Yeah, we're going to learn all that later. Indicates the variable is a private variable. In the other case here, if it starts with two underscore, then we are trying to say it's so private and maybe it should not be accessed from outside the class. It's so private. In that case, we can use double underscore. Now, if a variable starts with an underscore double and ends with an underscore, then it means it's a Python defines special variable within the Python APIs. It means it's part of Python. You're going to see a lot of that later on. We are going to see Python specific variables which are only unique to Python. So Python tries to tells us not to use this kind of identifiers because Python itself, the writers of Python or the developers of Python use this internally to declare several things. We are going to be seeing some of these things later on. All right, we can see identifier. Now, like I told you, an identifier stores stuff in the RAM at a given address. You know, if you have a 4 GB RAM and the identifier takes, for example, a number, this can be 32 bits, or let's say, I don't know, 16 bits, 32 bytes, 4 bytes, which is about 32 bits or something. So let's say Python stores this somewhere. Let's run this. Okay. All right, so this has gone. Now let's try to see the location where Python stored some of this variable. In Python, you use the ID operator. The ID operator helps you to see where Python stores certain variable. But I want to print it out, so I'll use print it out, and let's see var1. So in this case, I'll also print this out, and let's say var2. So I just want to show you how Python does things, and let's print this out so that I'll see var, not var this time, but num1 stop, or yeah. So let's see a couple of the address locations where Python will store this. So okay, so you see the address location. Sorry, I'm supposed to use var2 here. Memory. We are trying to get, remember I told you Python, the identifier helps us to identify a variable, you understand, for storage, but Python actually stores it somewhere in the memory of our computer. And as you can see, some complex stuff. I think this is the binary number, but you know, memory addresses are usually in hexadecimal digits. But here we have a binary number. So just for you to understand. All right, so in this case, we have an ID. Now let's also use ID here. Sorry, the Intellisense is just too much. Oh God. All right, so let's use ID here. Okay, so Intellisense is when an ID like this one tries to propose things to you, or tries to show you a lot of information about a particular class or a method. So it's good, but sometimes it's bad, like it prevents me from typing a lot of stuff. So all right, so we have num1. All right, let's see this. Okay, so I'm going to run this. All right, so these are the different memory locations. You see they are close to each other. So the Python goes to our RAM, allocates memory addresses, and then it stores this variable there. If you want to go deeper and see the exact memory address where Python is, we may never need this in programming, but just to show you, Python stores this somewhere in memory. So this is the ID. But you know we can't cram these long numbers in our program, so that's why we use identifiers to locate the variable. So you see, I told Python to save this variable somewhere, and you see later on I can come and print the variables. I can print the variables. Now I don't need to print that complex memory location. I just need to print it using the identifier I told Python to use. Now once I do this, Python goes to memory, it does all the hard work, it goes, it checks where the memory address this identifier is linked to. For example, I think this is it, then it gets the value in that memory address and it sends it back to us. But we don't need to go through all that, we just need to specify our identifier. Anytime we need to use the variable, we just need to specify our identifier. So in this case, as you can see, I can print the variables here, and see 10, 30, and 20. Yeah, that's var2, num1 stop, and num2 stop. All right, so that's simple enough. All right, now next we are going to see some how we can use identifiers, you know, some good examples. Initially, we are going to see how we can use it to declare variables. So initially, I'm going to run this so we can see the output. Yeah, so we are going to check. All right, so here we see we have an identifier, here a variable. We assign a string stuff to it. Here we have another identifier, sum. We are assigned the sum of 30. You see these operators are used in Python, so you can't be part of an identifier like I told you earlier. Now we can print whatever is in sum. So you see print asset output 1 sum. Now you see we can just use the name of our identifier directly. Python does all the work to get the variable for us, but we know whatever is in sum is it will be the result of adding 30 to 40.5. So in this case, let's see the output. It's called output 1. Let's see, output 1 is 70.5. All right, now we have another identifier, str1. We store hello. Str2 world. We have an identifier which should be the concatenation. We call when we use plus addition with two strings. What happens is Python does what we call concatenation. If it's with number, Python does what we call addition. But in this case, it's called concatenation. It's like appending two strings together. So we expect hello world at the end of this. So let's see, print output 2. Let's see, output 2. You see, we have hello world. Yeah. So let's move on, and we see, in this case, we see we are trying to declare a function. So identifiers can be used for many things, like we saw in the definition above. It can also be used to declare functions. So we are going to learn about functions later on in a different video, but in this case, you just need to understand a function is like a piece of code that can be used repeatedly multiple times throughout the program, you know. So if you have a piece of code which you took some time to write and you don't want to write that code many times, you just you put it in a function and you can use it a million times in your code, you know. Every time you run it, the same code is going to be run. So we have a function here which does a couple of stuff we would not like to do frequently. It actually takes two variables. We're going to learn function later, and you know we have fee. He actually says fee is equals to var 2 times 200, print fee is fee, return var 1 times. All right, so we are going to learn about function, but just to note, here we call that function. We can call the function and we pass it two variables. It expects 30 and 50. So the function will tell us the fee. You can see here fee equals to, I think, 100, a million. All right, so what next? We can see we have a class name, class employee. Yeah, so variables can also, identifiers can also be used to declare classes. Like I told you earlier, by conversion, class name starts with a capital letter. We have a class name here. It has two methods. Here's the constructor. We are going to learn all that later on, blah, blah, blah. It has one method here, display name. And we see prints employee self.name. You know, it create a new employee, you pass it a name, and when you call a method called display name, it prints out the name. So you can see we create an employee named John Smith, you see. So that's it. You can see here we initialize two objects of our class. We have two instances of, we are going to learn all this. I'm just showing you examples of how you can use an identifier. So here you see we create an identifier called new employee, which is equals to an instance of our new class. We pass the name John Smith. The employee object does its work, and then we have another variable identifier. We create an instance of employee again, and we pass Brew division. And new employee again, we have display name. We call the display name method of the employee, and we see, you know, it does some work and creates the name. So we see print number of employees. We can also call a static method up here. See employee dot so we are going to learn all that, but I just want to show you can also use identifiers for class names. For example, in this case we have employee. Now when you're writing Python, sometimes you want to use codes design written by others or code written by Python. So sometimes we use what we call imports. So you see, when you want to import, you see you give a name, import OS. In this case, we are importing what we call OS. That's some operating system tools. And then, so in this case, it's an identifier. It's supposed to be a valid identifier. In this case, OS, of course, is a valid identifier. Now, but here you can choose what you want because OS is a specific object in Python. But just to note, it's an identifier. It's always be a valid identifier. So you see, we are calling a method, it's an object, so we are calling a method get working directory, which is found in the OS. So in this case, we say os.get working directory, and you can see we are printing it. Python is going to tell me my current working directory, which is some part of my file. So blah blah blah. So that's it for this video. I hope you have understood the basic of Python identifier, which is the basic of programming. You understand? So with identifiers, you can start your programming journey and we can move onward to see what else Python has to offer to us. All right, thanks for your time and hope to see you in the next video. All right, have a nice time. Thank you.